It all began on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning that was meant to be ordinary. The sun stretched across the neat suburban lawns, bouncing off freshly waxed cars and polished fences. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities, where every house looked like a mirror of the next, with manicured hedges trimmed to identical shapes and driveways free of a single oil stain. It was the picture of perfection, the kind of perfection that only existed under the unyielding watch of a homeowners association. For years, the HOA had ruled the neighborhood with the kind of authority most small governments would envy. They dictated the color of the mailboxes, the height of the grass, even how long holiday decorations could remain up after a season had passed. Most people followed the rules without resistance, even when they grumbled under their breath. After all, living here wasn't just about owning a home. It was about belonging to an image of order and status. But then came the letter. It arrived without fanfare, tucked neatly into a standard HOA envelope, slipped under the door as if it were just another reminder about community pool hours or trash collection schedules. But when the envelope was opened, it contained something no one could have predicted. Inside was an official-looking notice, stamped with the HOA's seal, demanding a payment of $550,000 in what it described as community restructuring fees. The letter went further, explaining that the HOA board had voted to impose a one-time special assessment. According to them, the funds were necessary for upgrading neighborhood facilities, reinforcing property values, and ensuring future community excellence. It was dressed in legal jargon, wrapped in the appearance of legitimacy, but at its core, it was nothing more than a demand for $500,000 from each household. Most people were stunned into silence. Some immediately panicked, whispering about remortgaging their homes or selling entirely. Others convinced themselves it had to be a mistake, a typo that would soon be corrected. But one person wasn't willing to stay quiet. My wife. Unlike many of our neighbors, she didn't shrink from confrontation, especially not when the demand was so outrageous. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of her, her expression cold and calculating. The HOA might have expected obedience, but what they received was defiance. Word spread quickly that she had refused to pay. In a neighborhood where conformity was the law, her refusal was practically a declaration of war. Some neighbors admired her courage in private, sending hushed messages of support. Others feared the consequences, distancing themselves and whispering that she was reckless. But the loudest reaction came from one particular resident. Her name was Karen, though most people knew her as the HOA's unofficial enforcer. She wasn't just a board member. She was the kind of person who thrived on power, the kind who would measure your lawn with a ruler and report you for leaving a trash can visible for more than 10 minutes. For her, the HOA wasn't just a community, organization. It was a kingdom, and she was determined to be its queen. When she learned that my wife had refused to pay the $550,000, it was as if a personal challenge had been issued. She stormed across the neighborhood in her bright pink cardigan, clipboard in hand, her face twisted with the kind of righteous fury only someone convinced of their own authority could possess. To her, my wife's refusal wasn't just disobedience, it was rebellion that had to be crushed publicly. Karen filed complaint after complaint, citing obscure bylaw violations, sending warning letters, and leaving notes stuck to the door. She accused us of everything from improper landscaping to undermining community harmony, but nothing worked. My wife ignored it all, standing firm as the pressure mounted. Then came the moment that escalated everything beyond repair. Karen, unsatisfied with warnings and desperate to reassert control, decided to call the police. She claimed my wife was endangering the community by refusing to comply with the HOA's lawful directives. To her, this was the ultimate weapon, bringing in law enforcement to intimidate, to force compliance through fear. The night the patrol car rolled into the neighborhood, the glow of its headlights cutting across the pristine lawns, every curtain, in every house twitched. Neighbors peeked from their windows, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. The HOA had always been powerful, but this was new territory. The officer stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. Under the brim of his cap, Karen was already there, gesturing wildly with her clipboard, pointing toward our home as though she were exposing a criminal. The neighbors whispered and watched, certain this would be the moment my wife was humiliated into submission. But what happened instead was something no one could have predicted. The officer listened. He stood silently as Karen made her accusations, her voice shrill with authority. And then, when he turned toward my wife, his entire demeanor shifted. Instead of confrontation, there was respect. Instead of intimidation, there was recognition. He straightened, saluted sharply, and with a firm voice, addressed her with a title no one in the neighborhood had ever heard spoken aloud before. "Yes, Admiral." The entire street seemed to freeze. Karen's face drained of color, her clipboard nearly slipping from her hand. The neighbors gasped, unsure of what they had just witnessed, and that was the moment everything changed. The silence that followed the officer's salute was heavier than any siren. It stretched across the cul-de-sac like a net, holding every witness in place. Curtains fluttered back into position, but the eyes behind them stayed wide open. For a neighborhood obsessed with gossip, this moment was pure gold. Something they would retell and exaggerate for years. But even in its rawest truth, it was unbelievable. The woman Karen had just accused of disobedience, the woman who had refused to pay the HOA's outrageous $550,000 demand, was suddenly revealed as someone far more than just a stubborn homeowner. She was an admiral. Not in the honorary sense, not a title from some long-forgotten club, but in the truest, most official way. The officer's words weren't for show. His salute wasn't a mistake. It was recognition, acknowledgement of a chain, of command that extended far beyond the tidy hedges and strict bylaws of this suburban development, and that truth hit harder than anything else. Karen, for once, didn't know what to say. Her entire persona had been built on intimidation, on using rules like weapons, on wielding authority where none was truly deserved. But in this moment, she was exposed. Her voice faltered, her hands trembled, and worse, everyone had seen it. The iron grip she held over the community had slipped in a single instant. My wife, my Admiral, stood calmly at the door, unshaken. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even glance at Karen. Her expression was unreadable, as if the confrontation itself was beneath her notice. She simply acknowledged the officer's salute with a curt nod, the kind of nod that had probably once commanded fleets and operations larger than any of us could imagine. The officer, with his duty clear, assured her he would handle the situation. But the words carried more weight than Karen had anticipated. Instead of marching toward us with accusations, he turned to Karen herself. His tone hardened, his posture squared, and in a voice sharp enough to cut through her practiced outrage, he told her that wasting law enforcement's time with false claims carried consequences. He explained that homeowners' associations were not governing bodies with legal jurisdiction, and that no resident could be compelled to pay money under duress outside the proper civil process. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish stranded on dry land. She tried to protest, but the officer wasn't listening anymore. His allegiance, his respect, was fixed firmly on the woman standing behind our front door. When the patrol car pulled away and the neighborhood lights dimmed, Karen's power evaporated into the night air. She retreated to her house, slamming the door hard enough for the sound to echo down the street. But the damage was done. Her carefully constructed image as the ultimate authority had been cracked, and everyone had seen who had shattered it. The next morning, whispers rippled through the community like a storm blowing across still water. People gathered in driveways, huddled in small groups, desperate to understand what had happened. They speculated endlessly. Some believed the officer had made a mistake, a bizarre coincidence that couldn't possibly be true. Others insisted that my wife's past was more real than anyone had ever guessed. The word Admiral carried weight, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. Karen, however, refused to accept her loss of control. If anything, her obsession deepened. She doubled down, determined to reassert her dominance. She stormed into the HOA board meeting that week with a new wave of proposals, increased fines, stricter penalties, and even legal threats against insubordinate homeowners. She singled us out with such venom that some board members shifted, uncomfortably in their seats. But Karen didn't care. She couldn't let this go. What she didn't realize was that every move she made only strengthened my wife's position. Neighbors who once cowered from Karen's wrath now began to see her for what she truly was. A bully, armed with nothing but paper rules. In contrast, my wife's calm defiance radiated strength. People started looking to her, not as someone who had merely said no, but as someone who had exposed the limits of Karen's power. It wasn't long before others began quietly resisting. A family down the street refused to repaint their shutters, the HOA mandated shade of beige. Another neighbor ignored Karen's warning about leaving a bicycle in the yard. Small rebellions sprouted everywhere, subtle but deliberate, all of them emboldened by the knowledge that the woman Karen had tried to crush had stood tall without flinching. Karen noticed, and it drove her mad. She began patrolling the neighborhood. More aggressively, clipboard clutched like a weapon, stopping to glare at every lawn, every driveway, every porch light that didn't meet her imagined standard. But the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more people slipped through her fingers. Her threats began to ring hollow. Her complaints piled up unanswered. But Karen wasn't done yet. The HOA's board, though shaken, still carried weight, and Karen knew how to manipulate it. She whispered to them about financial ruin, about lawsuits, about chaos if the community failed to enforce its rules. She insisted that allowing one household to defy them would set a dangerous precedent. And slowly, she persuaded them that drastic action was necessary. It began with a motion to place a lien on our property for unpaid community restructuring fees. A lien was a serious escalation, an attempt to legally claim ownership over a home if debts weren't paid. It was the HOA's nuclear option, and Karen pushed it through with relentless pressure. But what Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood truly understood, was that my wife wasn't just a woman with a stubborn streak. She was an Admiral, a strategist who had navigated storms far greater than a suburban power trip. And while Karen plotted her legal ambush, my wife was already steps ahead, preparing a counterstrike that would make the entire neighborhood question everything they thought they knew about authority. The battle was no longer about a fee. It was no longer about lawns or shutters or bylaws. It was about power, about control, and about who truly held it. And soon, the HOA was about to learn what it meant to challenge an admiral. The lien notice arrived with a sharp slap against the mailbox, heavier than the usual stack of flyers and HOA newsletters. The envelope bore the HOA's seal in bold lettering, as though the sheer weight of the stamp could make it more legitimate. Inside, the language was sharp, clipped, and deliberately intimidating. The board had officially voted to file a lien against our property for unpaid restructuring fees. If the debt wasn't paid, they threatened, the house could eventually be seized and sold to recover the money. To the average homeowner, such a letter would inspire panic. A lien was no small matter. It tied itself like a chain around a home, dragging credit scores and financial security into ruin. It was the ultimate threat, and Karen knew it. She strutted through the neighborhood in the days that followed, her pink cardigan as much a uniform as any badge, whispering to those who would listen that justice was being served. She wanted fear to return to the community, to smother the sparks of rebellion that had begun to spread after the officer's salute. But in our home, there was no panic. There was no rushing to call lawyers in desperation, no frantic search for money. Instead, my wife treated the letter as if it were a poorly played opening move in a game she had mastered long ago. She read it once, set it down on the table, and began assembling her response, not with emotion, but with precision. She spent days gathering documents, notes, and carefully drafted statements. She combed through the HOA's bylaws, line by line, dissecting every clause with the discipline of someone accustomed to operating where small mistakes had catastrophic consequences. To her, this wasn't just paperwork. This was strategy, and she approached it with the same calm intensity she might have used when charting a naval course through hostile waters. Meanwhile, whispers of the lien spread quickly. Neighbors who had begun to resist Karen's grip felt their courage tremble. If the HOA could file a lien against us, what would stop them from targeting anyone else who dared to say no? The rebellion that had been bubbling beneath the surface faltered, replaced by a creeping unease. Karen noticed, and her confidence grew. She held court on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, spinning the lien into a warning for anyone who thought about following my wife's example. But her victory was an illusion. What Karen had underestimated was that my wife wasn't fighting alone. The officer's salute had not been a meaningless gesture. It had been recognition of service, of sacrifice, and of connections that extended far beyond this neighborhood. The title of Admiral wasn't ceremonial. It was earned, and with it came a network. a depth of respect, and a reservoir of authority that Karen couldn't begin to understand. The day of the HOA's board meeting arrived like a storm cloud. The community center parking lot overflowed, with cars as neighbors filed inside, eager to witness what they assumed would be the Admiral's downfall. The room buzzed with tension, the board seated at their long folding table. Karen at the center like a conductor ready to orchestrate her triumph. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it quickly shifted to the lean. Karen spoke with the smug certainty of someone convinced victory was already hers. She painted us as lawless, irresponsible, and dangerous to the harmony of the community. She waved the lien notice like a trophy, declaring it proof of the HOA's power. But when my wife rose to speak, the atmosphere changed. She didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she laid out her case with the cool precision of a commander issuing orders. She presented documented proof that the $550,000 restructuring fee had never been legally approved under the HOA's own bylaws. She pointed out procedural errors in the board's vote, conflicts of interest that invalidated their authority, and legal precedents that rendered their lien unenforceable. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions tightening as the weight of her words sank in. What had seemed like an unbreakable move by the HOA was being dismantled piece by piece. Neighbors leaned forward in their seats, their whispers rising as they realized Karen's victory wasn't inevitable after all. And then came the moment that shattered the illusion completely. My wife revealed that she had already contacted state authorities and filed a formal complaint against the HOA for overreach and fraudulent financial practices. The lien wasn't just unenforceable, it was illegal. The board, if it continued to pursue it, could face investigation and personal liability. Karen's composure cracked. For the first time, her confidence faltered in front of the very people she had ruled through fear. She stammered, tried to interject, but my wife didn't even look at her. She remained focused on the board, calm and steady, every word sinking deeper into the room. By the time she finished, the board members could no longer meet Karen's gaze. The lien motion was suspended indefinitely, pending investigation. The meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors demanding answers, whispers rising into shouts, accusations flying like sparks in a dry field. Karen left the room in silence, her clipboard pressed tightly against her chest, her face pale and tight with rage. But the damage was irreversible. The rebellion she had tried to crush with fear was reignited stronger than before. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to resist now knew the truth. The HOA's power wasn't absolute. Karen wasn't untouchable. And in the center of it all stood my wife, the Admiral, who had turned a suburban courtroom into her battlefield and walked away victorious. But victory, as she knew all too well, was never the end. It was only the beginning of the next conflict, and deep down, I could see it in her eyes. Karen wasn't finished. She had lost the battle, but she would not surrender the war. The storm was only gathering strength. The days following the board meeting were deceptively calm. On the surface, the neighborhood seemed to slip back into its routine. Lawns mowed, sprinklers ticking in unison, cars polished in driveways. But beneath that veneer of order, tension simmered. The rebellion had tasted its first real victory, and whispers of admiration for my wife spread through backyard fences and whispered phone calls. For the first time, Karen had been made to retreat, and people began to believe her grip on the community was weakening. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat. If anything, her humiliation only deepened her obsession. She disappeared from sight for a few days, and in her absence, some dared to hope she had been beaten into silence. But then she re-emerged, not diminished, but rearmed. She had always thrived, on control, but now she wanted revenge. And this time, she intended to fight not just through HOA bylaws and petty fines, but through every possible channel of influence she could muster. Her first move was to take the battle public. Within a week, carefully worded letters began circulating, not just in our neighborhood, but in nearby communities. Karen had drafted a community alert warning others about a dangerous precedent of lawlessness being set by residents who refused to comply with HOA directives. She painted my wife as a destabilizing force, someone undermining property, values, and threatening the safety of the neighborhood. The letters were polished, dressed up with legal language, and signed by Karen on behalf of the HOA board. Then came the smear campaign closer to home. Anonymous notes appeared in mailboxes, whispering accusations that my wife had lied about her military service, that her title was fabricated, that the officer's salute had been staged for show. Some neighbors scoffed at the rumors, but others hesitated, unsure of what to believe. Karen knew doubt was a weapon, and she wielded it with precision. Still, the smear campaign wasn't enough. Karen needed something bigger. That was when she reached beyond the neighborhood. She contacted local news outlets, pitching them a story about a rogue resident refusing to comply with lawful HOA demands. She painted herself and the board as victims, guardians of order being undermined by a stubborn troublemaker. One evening, a local news van rolled into the subdivision, its cameras capturing the pristine lawns and cookie-cutter houses. They knocked on doors, eager to capture sound bites from neighbors. But the footage never turned into the story Karen had envisioned. When the reporter approached my wife, expecting defensiveness, they instead found calm authority. She spoke not of defiance, but of principle, of protecting homeowners from exploitation, of standing up against abuse of power, of ensuring that communities remained places of safety rather than control. Her words carried weight, her presence undeniable. When the cameras rolled, she wasn't just a homeowner under siege. She was a leader, and it showed. The story that aired painted a very different picture than Karen had hoped. Instead of condemning my wife, it questioned the HOA's overreach, highlighted the absurdity of a $550,000 fee, and hinted at corruption within the board. Overnight, the narrative shifted. Karen had tried to brand my wife as a villain, but the spotlight transformed her into a symbol of resistance. Karen's fury was boundless. If she couldn't win through perception, she would escalate through force. At the next HOA board meeting, she presented a motion unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before, to initiate foreclosure proceedings against our home. She claimed the unpaid fees constituted grounds for seizure, and that the HOA had both the right and the duty to act. It was a dangerous move, legally shaky but possible if pursued aggressively enough. The room fell silent as Karen made her case, her voice sharp with anger, her clipboard trembling with the force of her grip. Some board members hesitated, but others, cowed by her relentless pressure, nodded along. It was then that my wife revealed the depth of her preparation. She arrived at the meeting not with angry words or scattered notes, but with a binder thick with documentation. She exposed not just the illegality of the foreclosure attempt, but the financial mismanagement of the HOA itself. She presented evidence of funds misallocated, of contracts awarded to companies with ties to Karen, of expenses buried in vague line items that masked personal benefit. The room erupted. Neighbors gasped, board members turned pale, and for the first time, Karen's allies began to distance themselves. What had been a foreclosure motion quickly spiraled into something else entirely, an investigation into the HOA's financial integrity. Karen's mask cracked completely that night. She shouted over the uproar, tried to reclaim control, but no one was listening anymore. The more she fought, the more desperate she appeared. And as the meeting dissolved into chaos, one truth became undeniable. Karen's reign was crumbling, but my wife understood something the others didn't. Karen was cornered, and cornered people didn't surrender. They lashed out. That night, as we walked home beneath the glow of street lamps, I saw the look in my wife's eyes. The calm, steady focus of someone who knew a storm was coming. Karen had been wounded, but she wasn't finished. And the next move, my wife knew, would be the most dangerous one yet, because Karen wasn't just fighting for control of an HOA anymore. She was fighting for her pride, her identity, her entire existence as the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, and pride, when threatened, was capable of destruction far greater than any bylaw could contain. The fallout from the financial revelations spread through the neighborhood like a wildfire. For years, the HOA had operated with unquestioned authority, collecting dues, issuing fines, and spending funds without much scrutiny. But once the mask was ripped away, people began asking questions that Karen couldn't answer. Neighbors who had once trembled at the sight of her pink cardigan now eyed her with suspicion. At every corner of the cul-de-sac, whispers carried the same theme. How much had she stolen? How long had she been abusing the system? And how many people had suffered under her false authority while she lined her own pockets? The board fractured under the pressure. Some members resigned quietly, retreating into the shadows to avoid accountability. Others tried to distance themselves from Karen, claiming they had never truly supported her decisions. For the first time, she stood nearly alone, her iron grip loosening with every passing day. But Karen wasn't finished. She knew her empire was collapsing, and with it, her identity. She had built her life around this power, feeding on control, like oxygen, and she could not imagine existence without it. To lose now would be more than embarrassment. It would be annihilation. And so she escalated. It began with the legal papers. She filed lawsuits, multiple, overlapping, and deliberately confusing. She targeted not just my wife but the neighbors who had dared to support her. Each lawsuit was baseless, filled with exaggerated claims and legal jargon meant to intimidate. The goal wasn't victory in court, it was exhaustion, to drown her opponents in fear and paperwork until they surrendered. But Karen miscalculated. Where others might have panicked, my wife responded with discipline. She cataloged every document, consulted with legal experts, and built a countercase brick by brick. To her, Karen's legal blitz wasn't chaos. It was a battlefield, and she had faced far worse under far greater pressure. She didn't just respond. She prepared to turn the lawsuits back on Karen, exposing them as harassment and abuse of process. When that failed to break us, Karen turned to intimidation. Strange vehicles began circling the neighborhood at odd hours. Anonymous phone calls filled the nights with static and whispered threats. Notes were left on doorsteps, written in jagged handwriting, warning of consequences if resistance continued. The neighbors grew uneasy. Some urged my wife to back down, to find compromise, to avoid pushing Karen further. But compromise was impossible. Karen had drawn the battle lines too clearly, had escalated too far. The only way forward was through. And then came the most shocking move yet. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses gold, several police cars rolled into the neighborhood. Sirens off, lights flashing faintly, they pulled to a stop in front of our house. Neighbors emerged from doorways. Children peered. Through windows, hearts thudded in chests. Karen followed behind them in her car, her face alight with triumph. She had done it again. She had brought law enforcement to her side. But this time, it wasn't just one officer. It was several, and their demeanor was tense, serious. Karen wasted no time, leaping from her car with her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She pointed toward our home, her voice rising with shrill accusations. She claimed fraud, threats, and community endangerment. She demanded immediate action. The officers listened. But when my wife stepped outside, the air shifted instantly. There was a pause, a silence heavy with recognition. These were not just local patrol officers. Some of them wore insignias that marked them as higher ranking. And when they saw her, their posture changed. One by one, they straightened, acknowledging her presence not as a civilian, but as someone who had once commanded authority even they respected. The neighborhood froze. The officers turned, not on us, but on Karen. Their questions cut through. Her accusations with surgical precision, exposing inconsistencies, demanding evidence she could not provide. Her voice cracked as she tried to maintain her composure. But the more she spoke, the more absurd her claims became. And then, in front of the entire neighborhood, the lead officer informed her that her actions, false reports, harassment, and misuse of police resources, were under review. The clipboard that had been her shield for years suddenly seemed useless in her hands. The neighbors erupted in whispers. Some gasped aloud. The sight of Karen, speechless and cornered, was something few had ever imagined possible. For once, her power had not only failed her but backfired. But my wife knew this wasn't the end. Karen was desperate now, more desperate than ever. Each escalation had failed, each weapon stripped from her grasp. That left only one thing: recklessness. And reckless people, when cornered, could be dangerous. That night, as the flashing lights faded and the neighborhood slowly returned to stillness, I saw my wife sitting at the kitchen table once again, her hands folded, her eyes focused. She was calm, but beneath the calm was preparation. She knew the war had reached its breaking point. Karen had lost her grip on the HOA. She had lost her grip on the neighbors. She had even lost her grip on law enforcement. And that meant she had nothing left to lose. The Admiral was ready. Because the next strike Karen launched would decide everything. Whether the neighborhood remained under her crumbling rule, or finally broke free once and for all. The calm before the storm didn't last long. For days, Karen remained unusually quiet, retreating behind the blinds of her immaculate home. But everyone in the neighborhood felt the tension building. It was the silence of a cornered predator, waiting for the moment to strike. The board was fractured, investigations were looming, and the neighbors were no longer afraid of her. Karen had lost everything except the one thing she clung to most, her pride. And it was pride, wounded and raging, that made her final move inevitable. It began on a Thursday night. While most of the neighborhood prepared for bed, Karen made her last gamble. She gathered what remained of her influence, a handful of bored, loyalists and a few neighbors still terrified enough to obey, and stormed the community center after hours. From there, she declared an emergency HOA session, a spectacle designed not to govern, but to reclaim her lost throne. The agenda was simple and outrageous. Immediate foreclosure on our home, removal of our family from the neighborhood, and a community protection order to bar my wife from ever returning. It was an act of desperation, legality abandoned in favor of sheer force. Karen didn't care if it was lawful anymore. She only cared about making a statement, that she was still in charge, that no one could defy her and walk away unscathed. But what Karen hadn't counted on was that the Admiral was already waiting. Word of the so-called emergency session spread quickly. Neighbors poured into the community center. No longer silent witnesses but active participants. Some came out of loyalty, others out of curiosity. But most came because they were tired. Tired of Karen's reign. Tired of her fear tactics. Tired of watching their community rot under her control. When Karen stood at the front of the room, clipboard clutched, her voice shrill as she demanded the board vote to strip us of our home, she expected obedience. What she received instead was silence. Cold, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of my wife rising from her seat. The Admiral did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She presented the results of her investigation, documents linking Karen to financial fraud, records of misused HOA funds, and testimony from contractors who admitted to sweetheart deals. She laid everything out with precision, each piece of evidence striking like artillery fire against Karen's crumbling defenses. Neighbors gasped. Board members shifted in their chairs, their loyalty disintegrating under the weight of undeniable proof. What had once been whispers was now fact, written in ink and backed by law. And then, as the final blow, my wife revealed that state regulators had already been contacted. Investigators were on their way. The HOA wasn't just facing internal collapse. It was facing legal consequences that reached far beyond the cul-de-sac. Karen's face drained of color. She sputtered, tried to shout, tried to twist the narrative, but her words fell flat. No one listened. Not anymore. It was then that the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the room. The same officer who had once saluted the Admiral entered, this time accompanied by officials carrying folders and badges. The crowd parted as they walked forward, their presence commanding immediate attention. The officer didn't look at us. He looked directly at Karen. His voice, calm but unyielding, announced that she was under investigation for fraud, harassment, and misuse of community funds. The clipboard that had been her weapon for years slipped from her fingers and clattered. To the floor, the neighbors erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Years of fear and resentment boiled over into applause, into cheers, into the kind of raw emotion that comes when people realize they are finally free. Karen was led away, her protests drowned out by the sound of a community breaking her grip, at last. The pink cardigan, once a symbol of control, now hung limp and powerless. When the room settled, all eyes turned to my wife. She didn't bask in the victory, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. She simply nodded, acknowledging the neighbors, not as followers, but as equals. Her work here wasn't about power. It was about restoration, about protecting the integrity of the place we all called home. The board was dissolved. A new council would be elected, one built on transparency and accountability. The outrageous $550,000 fee was erased, along with every baseless fine Karen had ever imposed. Slowly, the neighborhood began to heal, freed from the shadow of her rule. That night, as we returned home, the street felt different. The air was lighter, the silence peaceful instead of tense. Neighbors waved, some with gratitude, others with newfound courage. The battle was over. Inside, my wife folded away the last of her documents and closed the binder for good. She wasn't just the Admiral anymore. She was a neighbor, a protector, and most importantly, someone who had refused to be broken by arrogance and greed. Karen had tried to use the HOA to build an empire of fear, but in the end, it was torn down, not with shouting, not with violence, but with discipline, strategy, and unshakable resolve. And though she never said it aloud, I knew my wife had taught everyone in that neighborhood a lesson they would never forget. True authority isn't seized, it's earned. The HOA war was over, and the Admiral had won.